Hi there. In today's demonstration, I'm going to show you how you can build a custom flow failure history for Power Automate. So you may have received the automated emails from Power Automate to alert you to the fact that one of your flows has been failing regularly, or maybe potentially several of your flows have been failing regularly. And you want to go back and have a look at the history. Now, over a period of time, 28 days I believe, flow history will actually be deleted, and you won't be able to look back at the cause of why a flow failed. But in today's demonstration, I'm going to show you how you can save those flow failures into a SharePoint list, or if you preferred, Dataverse. And then with that data, you can build up your own history and keep track of all your flows. So without further ado, let's jump into my demonstration. So here I am in a Microsoft list on my SharePoint site, and you can see it's called Monitor My Flows. I have several columns, including the flow name, which is the default title, an action name, which is the action within flow that has failed, an error code, which is provided to us by flow, and an error message. And you can see on some occasions this message is actually empty or blank. We also have a column here for the flow run history, which is a personalized link to the history of that run. And like I mentioned in the intro, you can only access this for the first 28 days. But by clicking on one of these links, it will take you to the actual history run of this flow. Now, the only other thing to note on this Microsoft list is for this particular column, error message, I've set the default data type to multi-line of text, and that's because some of these error messages exceed the 255 character limit of the basic text data type. So if we now jump into my flow, I have a flow here that's built based on a manual trigger, and I have a variable that I'm initializing. And the thing to note here is for variables, you can't include them in scopes, and that plays a part later on. It's unlikely that a variable is going to cause an error, but if you do have any variables, you cannot initialize them inside a scope as things stand. And then I have a scope here that is called try, and it's within this scope that I have the actions for my flow. So when you traditionally build a flow, you probably don't use a scope, you probably just insert all the various actions, apply to eaches, etc. to build your flow. If you want to use this method, you need to insert those actions into a scope like so. Now we're going to be using an expression known as result, and I'll copy this link so you can read the documentation. It'll be in the description of the video. What this will do is it will return the results from the top level actions in the specified scoped action, such as for each, until, or scope. So what does that mean? So if you have a scope like we do here called try, if we run the results expression on try, it will be able to return the error message for the compose and for the apply to each, but it won't be able to return the error message for the compose within the apply to each, because the apply to each itself is also a scoped action. So if we did indeed want to get the specific error message from an apply to each, we'd have to run that same expression not only on the try, but also on the apply to each to then return the error message from my compose in this case. So this is the basis of my basic flow. Like I say, traditionally you might not have it in a scope, but for this to work you need to have it in one of these scopes. And in traditional programming language, I've called this the try. Now you'll notice that the arrow here for the next stage is in red, and what I've done is I have gone into the settings of my next scope, which is called catch, and that contains all the logic that will handle a flow when it fails. And so if I click on the three dots or the ellipses and go into the configure run after, you'll see that it will not run when it's successful, it will only run when the above scope, the try, has failed, skipped, or timed out. So by doing that, that'll mean that my scope here called catch will only run if something in this scope above fails. Now, if we look at this catch scope in more detail, what I have first of all is a filter array. So using that expression that I mentioned earlier, the result expression, you'll see that I'm looking at try. So try from above is the name of the scope. That's what we're going to look at as an output, which will be an array. And then we're going to specifically filter on the status. So using the expression item, open close bracket, question mark, square bracket, single quotes, and status, we're checking to see if that equals to failed. And all that'll do is it will return all the objects within that array that have failed. And most likely they'll be just the one. And then we have a select action. And so what that select action is doing is it's taking the body of this filter array, which is one of the dynamic blocks that you'll get when you go into the from here. And then I'm mapping out the error code, the error message, and the action name. Now the reason that I do that and I use a select action is because the next stage is to create an HTML table. And if I went straight to the output of the filter array, there would be a whole host of data from the array that would appear in that HTML table. I could use the advanced options, but instead I'm using a select here to map out the fields that I'm looking for. So the error code is based on something called a coalesce. Now the coalesce is quite a handy expression that will return the first value from a list of values that isn't null or empty. So there are two places that the error code might appear in the array. The first one is based on item, error, and then code, as you can see here. The second one is based on item code. And so what this coalesced expression will do is it will first of all check this particular object to see if there's a value that exists. If it's null or empty, it will then check this second one, which is item code. And by using that coalesce function, it means it will return either the first one or, if null or empty, the second one. Then when it comes to the error message, we have a slightly more simple expression, which is based on the item, open close brackets, and then a question mark, square brackets with error / message. And then for the action name, similar expression, item with the brackets, question mark, square brackets with name in single quotes, as you see on the screen there. Now for creating the HTML table, all we have to do is use the output from the select action above. Now, I have created myself a SharePoint list, as we've seen here. And so one of the actions that I've got as part of my flow is to create an item. So see here, the next item, or the next action, is to create an item on my SharePoint list in my Monitor My Flows list. And then I'm using another expression known as workflow. And what workflow does is return various parameters from within the workflow itself. And you can see the expression there is looking at tags / flow display name. And so that will return the name of my particular flow that it's running on. Then for the action name, I'm using first based on the name of the filter array. And the reason I use first is the filter array will be an array. And so the first expression will return the first and only name into this particular parameter on create items. If you try and insert the name as an expression, you will get an error about integer index, or potentially be put into an apply to each loop. Then, similar to the error code that we had in our select action, I'm using a coalesce, but this time, rather than it being based on item error code, it's based on the first body of the filter array, which hopefully you can see on screen there. Then for the error message, we're using the first again on the body of the filter array for error and message. And then finally, the piece of magic here is constructing the flow history URL. So we're using a concatenation, so the expression concat. Now this is based on the UK history, And if we have a look at a flow history later on, you'll be able to see the URL at the top. But if you look at my particular URL here, you can see it's based on United Kingdom. And so what I'm doing here is I'm concatenating the URL for all the way up to environments that you see there, which is the same as along the top here. And then using the workflow expression to retrieve the environment name, which in this case would be default with the following GUID. I then have the /flow that we can see here, which again we can pick out from the URL at the top here. And then we're using this workflow expression again to get the name of our flow, which is this GUID here. And then in order to return the history, we have runs, and then finally the history GUID, which is based on run name. So I'll copy that particular expression into the description so you don't have to worry about trying to recreate this. And my aim is also to do an article on this too, so I will include all these expressions in that article so that you can easily copy them. So now that we've got the flow run history, I have just for ease included that workflow expression in another compose just so we can see it in the flow history after a run. Then in order to notify myself or the team, I'm either going to use a send an email action or a post a message to a chat or channel so that we can alert ourselves to the fact that one of our flows has failed. And again, you'll see that I'm using the workflow expression to retrieve the display name of the flow. And then also I'm using the output of the HTML table and this concatenation that creates our flow history URL. And then finally, I have a terminate. And the reason I have a terminate is if I didn't include this, the flow would actually always succeed, because based on the above try scope, if that all succeeded, then the scope below wouldn't run and the flow would pass and mark it succeed. If our try scope failed and then our catch scope ran as a result of this run after setting here, if everything within here passed, then the flow will be marked as succeeded. I would still like to be able to see on the flow history that a flow has failed, and so I've decided to use this cancelled status. You could of course use failed, but there may well be genuine cases when the flow fails, so I've decided to go for something slightly different, which is the cancelled status. So now that we've got this up and running, if I go ahead and test, this particular flow is built to succeed. So you'll see the try scope run and the catch scope will not run as a result of everything succeeding in the try scope. So we can see here on screen we have the try scope has completely succeeded and our catch scope has not run at all because we have this criteria here for the configure run after. Now if I go back into edit, and what I'm going to attempt to do now is to deliberately cause the flow to fail. So if I quickly have a look at my variable, it's basically an array. It's an array of my favorite colors, which is blue and green. And then I have an expression here to return the first favorite color from this array. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to break this expression by removing first, and I'll demonstrate the error that I was mentioning earlier. If you try and retrieve a value from an array, it will give us an error message about an integer index because we are looking at objects within this array and we need to call it by number, 0, 1, 2, etc., or by using the expressions first or last. So I'll go ahead and run that flow, and I heard there my email come in, but if we just wait for this to run. So we can see that the try has failed, and it's failed based on the compose action because I've now created an error in my flow. And you can see the error message there is complaining about the integer index because we're no longer looking for the first or a value by number. And if I go into my catch, you can see everything that's run there. We have a filter array of the actions that have run. We have filtered based on failed. We're then selecting the particular values for the error code, error message, and the action name that we can see there. I've created a custom HTML table. I've created an item. I did mention that I've created this compose action purely for information, so you can see things like the ID, the name of the flow display name, environment name. So there's quite a lot of useful information here that you might want to use in your future flows, but that's the workflow expression and purely there for information. And then we have the send email and post email, and our final action being terminate, which results in our flow displaying as cancelled. Now if I go into my email, you can see here that I have received an email with an HTML table telling me the error code and the error message and the action name that's failed. And if I click on the link here, it'll open me up into the history of that specific run. So you can see there it ran on the 15th of the 1st at 9:16, which is right now. And that will enable us to then look at the history. Now if I also jump onto Microsoft Teams, I've done exactly the same. I have a message that's popped up, so the flow has failed, with the name of the flow, and again the error code message and name and the flow history. So just quickly back onto the flow, we can see there that's now opened with the flow history based on that link. So the next thing I'd like to try and do is to demonstrate what happens if it fails within the apply to each. So I'm just going to take out this variable and just put the number 123, which will mean this compose action will now pass. And I'm going to put in something in here that's going to cause an error. And we're going to base that on this particular loop. So I'm going to specify an item that I know will not exist. And so if you're ever building expressions for arrays, if you put in a question mark, as you can see there, and the particular object or key name doesn't exist, then you will return null and you won't get a message. If I take that out and put in the name of something that I know doesn't exist, then it will fail. Or at least that's the hope anyway in this demonstration. So I'll go ahead and save that. And so I'm now expecting my apply to each to fail. And remember from the reference guide here for the result expression, it will not be able to tell me that the compose action has failed. It will only be able to tell me that the apply to each has failed. So I'll go ahead and test that. And we hit the run button. And this time when we see the flow history open up, we will be able to look at that try scope again, and this time our apply to each has failed, and we can see that my compose action within my apply to each has failed. Now if I jump into my email, I've now received my next email. It's told me that an action has failed and no dependent actions have succeeded, and the action name is based on apply to each. So we don't get to see from this particular run that the compose action has failed. Now what we can do here is we can actually create another select statement or another filter array based on our apply to each, because our apply to each is a scope. We can use the result expression, and if we do that, we can then append these two array results based on the try and then the apply to each, and create a table based on that result. So if I go back into edit, and what I'm going to do next is I'm going to copy this filter array and I'm going to paste it in here, add an action, go to my clipboard. You can see I have the filter array, paste that in, and that gives me my second filter array. And then I'm going to edit this result here and put in apply to each, remembering that any space has to be filled with an underscore. And we'll just go ahead and update that. And with our select action now, rather than it being based on the body of our filter array, I actually want it to be based on the union of the two filter arrays. So I'm going to go and create an expression here, union, and I'm going to put in the first body, comma, and then the second body, and hit OK. And that will bring these two arrays together. And if there's more than one result, we'll end up with two rows in our HTML table. Now what it won't handle is the creating of an item. At the moment we will still only get one item being created, and because we use the first, it will be based on the first error message that we retrieve. So I'll go ahead and hit test. We'll save and test again. And then we'll run that flow. If we just quickly jump into our email and load up the table, you can see now we have the action failed as before for apply to each, but we also have the error code, which is not specified, for our compose action. So we can see that our compose action within our apply to each has now failed. And similarly, if we look at our Teams message, we have the identical table. So I'm going to create a new flow now and show you how quickly it is to reuse that catch scope that I built earlier. So we'll go into a new step, and the first thing we need to do is we need to add a scope, because of course we need to have all of the actions that we're looking to monitor in a scope, and we'll go ahead and call that try. Then I'm going to add an action, and in this occasion I'm just going to use compose, and I'm just going to put in the number 1, 2, 3, because I then know that this particular compose will succeed. And then I'm going to go and use the SharePoint API action. Send an HTTP request. I'm going to pick a site address, and we'll just go from my DemoBird365 site. And for the URI, I'm just going to type in something random, and also for the headers, type in something random so that I know that this particular action will fail. Then if I go back into my original flow with my catch scope from before, I'm going to click on the ellipsis here and copy to my clipboard. And this is quite a handy feature to know about, that if you're ever building flows and wanting to copy functionality between them, if you put the actions into a scope, you can actually copy them between flows. So I'll go into my new flow, go to new step, go to my clipboard, and by hitting Control V, it will paste that whole scope into my clipboard and allow me to copy it into my new flow. Now before we run it, we need to configure the run after, because otherwise this catch scope will always run. And we'll go into the configure run after, untick the is successful, and make sure we tick the failed, the skipped, and the has timed out. Now the only other thing I need to remove here is because I added in the filter array 2, I won't have that because I don't have an apply to each, so I need to delete that, a bit of tidying up. And if I go into the select as well, I can't do a union anymore. I need to just look at the filter array body, so we'll just change that back to the body there. Now I can go ahead and save that, and pretty much I've been able to copy that whole catch scope and reuse it in a brand new flow, and it'll be tied to my SharePoint list or my Microsoft list, and it'll also be able to notify me in Teams and in my email. Now if I go ahead and hit continue and run flow, I heard my email come in there. So if I look at my try, I can see my compose worked. I can see my HTTP request failed. And the reason it's failed is because it was unauthorized. I didn't provide any credentials or authentication details. And I can see that my catch has run all the way to the bottom and terminated. If I go into the history, I can see that the test was cancelled. And that's because, of course, the end of the flow, it's marked as cancelled rather than succeeded or failed. And if I go into my email and load up my latest email, you can see that my new flow, which unfortunately I didn't rename, has the error code unauthorized, and the action that failed was send an HTTP request to SharePoint. So if I go back to my SharePoint list, we now have a series of flows that have failed. We have quite a good history building up here. And over time, we'll be able to see which of my flows are failing regularly, which error code, which action name, error messages, and of course, we've got the direct links back into the history. So as long as the flow ran within the last 28 days, I can click on the link for the occasion that it failed, and it'll bring me straight back into the history for that particular flow run. There it is. So that's our particular flow run. And if I go back into my Microsoft list, one of the other great things about list is, of course, the views we have here are all configurable. So I did create myself a list that allowed me to group by flow name. And we can see there I've got 3 flows that are obviously encountering problems. I can break that down even further into the error code. So we can see the solution for my error handling flow has failed both on action failed and invalid template. And again, I can expand that and look at the history of that flow for that particular failure code or error code. So there's a quick deep dive in how you can use the result expression to grab details of your particular actions, how they're failing. You can then save that into a Microsoft list so you can look back at the history and even create yourself a direct link back into the history of that particular flow run as long as it's within the last 28 days. And then finally, if you're looking to react quickly to a failure, you can send yourself an automated email or indeed a message in Teams to yourself or to a team channel to let yourself know or your team know that one of your important flows has failed. So again, I hope that's been of use, and if you have any comments, please make sure you leave them below, and if you haven't already, please make sure you like and subscribe. Thanks very much for watching. Cheers. Bye.